So our next speaker is David Miskell, and David is the Professional and Regulatory Services Officer in the Professional and Regulatory Services Department in the INMO. And David has been working alongside Dr. Edward Matthews. David provides advice and representation to members who are subject to fitness to practice complaints in the preliminary proceeding committee stage, and provides advice and representation to senior nurse managers regarding their terms and conditions of employment. David has a BA and an LLB, that's law, isn't it, David, from NUI Galway, a Master's in Industrial Relations from Smurfit Business School, a diploma in professional regulation from UCD. And David is a registered general nurse and completed his nursing in Tala Hospital, Trinity College. Thanks, David.
Thank you, Fiona, for that introduction. It's good to have the opportunity to speak with everyone today. I just want to see, can people see my screen?
Oh yeah, David. I can share for you if you want.
I think I have it there now. Is that right?
Perfect.
Yeah, so everyone can see me, yes? Okay, so I suppose what I'm going to spend, my presentation is probably, perhaps to a degree, it's slightly longer maybe than the allotted time. So there may be points where I'm going to skip through, but overall, I suppose what I want to go through with you is, I suppose, just an overview of what the process entails, but specifically, I suppose, what we are now encountering and perhaps some of the nuances that arise when a senior midwife or nurse manager is the subject matter of a complaint. And regrettably, over recent times, we have seen a rise in complaints against directors of nursing and midwifery and assistant directors. And unfortunately, whereas maybe in practice a lot of the time, in circumstances where a senior nursing or midwifery manager is not providing direct care to a patient, complaints may be less common. However, we're certainly seeing a rise in that, and I just suppose want to extrapolate some of the key principles that have emerged from that. But just by way of an overview, in circumstances where someone is subject to a complaint, it's in essence a three-stage process. At first instance, it's the preliminary proceedings committee, which is in essence an initial investigation, on foot of which a decision is made that no further action is taken, or it proceeds then onto a fitness to practice stage, which is in effect a full inquiry. And once a determination is made then from that inquiry, then it will go to the overall board for sanctions. Okay, so the committee are a statutory, and I'm going to cover, there are some legislative changes which I have actually updated in the next edition of World of Irish Nursing, but just I suppose the overall who they are, there is a statutory committee set up under provisions of the 2011 Act. It is a lay majority. However, nurses and midwives do sit on it. It's comprised of a chairperson, and in totality then there is 10 members, and ultimately their role is to consider complaints referred to it against registered nurses and midwives, and their role is to investigate, and ultimately it's to form an opinion as to whether or not further action is warranted. It's probably important to say that it's not necessarily their role to decide if there is wrongdoing in the ultimate sense, but it is, in essence, if there is a reasonable prospect of proving wrongdoing under the various headings of misconduct or wrongdoing contained in the code. Complaints can come from a variety of different sources. Other healthcare professionals, one's employer, a regulator, a member of the public, or the board itself. So for example, where situations we've encountered relatively recently where a nurse or a midwife might be involved in a matter that was perhaps reported in the media. And on that basis, then the board are entitled to, themselves are entitled to initiate the process in respect to that person on the basis of what is read. So I suppose in totality, you know, the complaints can come in from a wide variety of sources. Just to provide you with some overview, the statistics, the latest statistics that are available are from 2018. There was 191 new complaints, and if, for example, it was 78 in 2078, of which came over from 2017. Out of that 71, no further action was taken, and 24 of those were referred further on for an inquiry, and 7 of them were withdrawn by the persons who made the complaints. So, for example, insofar as one can extrapolate a broad, you know, sense of matters, 12 complaints over that time period related to more than one registrant, and with a range of 2 to 7. So sometimes they'll come across a situation where, you know, and a complaint will encompass a number of individuals. A majority of them are medication management is a very common issue. Failure to assess a patient's condition, identify deterioration, or a failure to take appropriate action during the course of deterioration in someone's presentation, or alternatively behavior allegations of verbal or physical abuse. I probably just go back to there, something we are seeing a rise in, and I always say to people, is social media complaints. Registrants and our members passing comment on, you know, an amalgam of different matters. You know, one needs to be extremely cautious what they post to social media, or offering opinions on anything, particularly at a senior level of our professions, because we are seeing a rise in that particular area in social media complaints. And in fact, this was actually referred to in a recent newsletter by NMBI themselves. And I think I had done a separate presentation on social media conduct, but for all of us as nurses and midwives, and particularly for senior members of our profession, it is vitally important to be extremely cautious about what one posts to social media, who one connects with, and, you know, overall what aspects of one's personal life does one posts to social media. It is a matter that needs, you know, that merits reflection, and to ensure that content is appropriate. There's 10 grounds of overall in total, there's 10 grounds of complaint that encompass professional misconduct, poor professional performance, a relevant medical disability, a failure to comply with a condition, which is quite both of the 3 of those are quite defined matters, a failure to comply with an undertaking, contravention of a section of the Act, a failure to comply with the Pricing and Supply of Medical Goods Act 13, or the Health Identifiers Act 2014, an irregularity in the custody or prescription of a supply of a controlled drug under the Misuse of Drugs Acts 1977 and 84, or another drug that is likely to be abused, or a conviction for an offence triable on indictment. And in respect of the latter, as I have alluded to it, the issues around medication are a complaint that comes up with a degree of regularity, and we have encountered, you know, recently situations where nurses and midwives have received, you know, convictions, and, you know, again, on that basis, that is the ground of the complaint. So it's very, very broad. I've covered it. Those are the types of complaints. I've probably alluded to them previously, but just in the context, I suppose, particularly of senior team members, which are director and assistant director level, I'd focus maybe a bit on the if we go down there, the failure to manage or ensure a facility is managed in a safe and appropriate manner, including records maintained and staffing levels. And that, I suppose, is the basis for a lot of the complaints that we have received in relation to senior nursing and midwifery managers. Now, again, I say that, and insofar as anyone that's here today needs me to say this, particularly in the context of COVID-19, I think it's fair to say it's been, a time of extraordinary challenges. Even sometimes that term in and of itself loses its meaning because it's so frequently used. But there's no question about it. What our members have been through, that's from staff nurse and midwife grade right up to the most senior echelons of our profession, which are our directors and assistant directors, but leading through the pandemic. And certainly from the feedback that I get has been extraordinarily challenging and is difficult. And very frequently senior members of the team, in my experience, you become the front facing person for a lot of grievances and matters of concern, and again, it's probably a species of why these complaints are on the rise. I don't say this, by the way, I hasten to add, to be alarmist or say that necessarily that there's a deluge of complaints in against directors and assistant directors, and ultimately, in all sets of circumstances, the INMO will fully defend these complaints. But where I suppose I'm flagging it, and we thought it was useful to have the discussion today, because I suppose of what, on the basis that we have seen a rise in such complaints. Some of the other grounds of complaint there, you will see I've probably covered them previously, but again, suffice to say that they can be quite broad. Professional misconduct in and of itself, okay, there's actually no definition in the legislation of what constitutes it, but I suppose there's a well-known case which relating to a medical practitioner, which is, I suppose, defined as conduct that can be viewed as infamous and disgraceful in a professional respect, or conduct which will not be infamous and disgraceful in another person, but could be as such by virtue of our professions. And in addition to that, then it can include infamous or disgraceful conduct involving a degree of moral turpitude, fraud, or dishonesty. So a practical example of that might be, if we say, and I've referred to previously, if we talk about moral turpitude, fraud, or dishonesty, for example, making a drug error, that potentially might be a matter or a ground of complaint. But for example, after the event, if someone sought to cover it up, that would introduce an additional dimension to the matter, which would encompass something like moral turpitude, fraud, and dishonesty, or a more general then heading of a serious falling short of conduct that's expected. And again, a further case there is, I've cited, is Perez versus the Nursing and Midwifery Board 2005, which defines a serious falling short, whether by omission or commission of the standards of conduct that is expected amongst nurses and midwives. That particular matter related to a nurse, which is why the reference is to nurses there. But that's obviously equally applicable to the midwifery profession. And similarly then, poor professional performance is defined in the Act, but it's a failure by a nurse or a midwife to demonstrate standards of competence, whether in knowledge, skill, or application of knowledge that might be reasonably expected of carrying out similar work. And it's a poor professional performance requires a threshold of seriousness. Ultimately, in the context of an inquiry and a case on behalf of NMBI against a nurse or a midwife, it's a criminal standard of proof that applies. And in circumstances where there is an inquiry, the board must prove beyond reasonable doubt that there is, conduct that has, impugned some aspect of, the legislation or the code. And that is how, the process operates. And I suppose that's where the INMO come in such circumstances, obviously, because we have the skill and expertise to, to deal with matters at that level. So I've probably covered some of these previously. So again, and I'm conscious of time because I do want to leave some time for perhaps or just to make sure that we run on time. But ultimately, then, in terms of what the preliminary proceedings committee can do, they can verify by an affidavit. They can, anything contained in the complaint. Supply more information, require, I suppose the nurse and the midwives themselves to require more, to supply more information. They can interview people, they can take statements, they can request persons to the PPC to provide statements in writing, which is how most of the work is conducted. It's done by statement, which we provide assistance with. I'm going to perhaps move forward here a little bit. Okay, so I've touched on this already, where, in terms of what the PPC does, they can decide there isn't sufficient cause to go any further. They could say, it could be referred to another body or authority, or ultimately then they can make the decision to go forward for a fitness to practice inquiry. It does happen that complaints are withdrawn, but just because a complaint is withdrawn, it doesn't mean that the matter is resolved immediately. It must ultimately, with the board's agreement, they can decide that no further action is to be taken, or alternatively, even if it is withdrawn, they can make the decision to proceed as if it hasn't been withdrawn. So again, it's, I suppose, just because something is withdrawn, it's not, it doesn't automatically mean that it's the end of it. So there are some legislative changes, which I have updated everyone in WIN in relation to, but just, I suppose, broadly stated, I suppose it's now going to be the CEO that investigates the complaint rather than the preliminary proceedings committee. There's a new ground of complaint, which is the imposition of a prohibition or restriction on nurse or midwife providing one or more than a particular kind of health or social care, which is practicing, in effect, different areas that they're not supposed to be. This ultimately then it is the CEO that will review the matter and then send the investigation report to the PPC, who can take the steps I've outlined there. There is another dimension to it as well. If a nurse or a midwife accepts this, then the investigation is at an end, but otherwise proceeds as if no request has been made. Then it's a new power which previously had been given to the Fitness to Practice Committee. We, just to provide some insight, the INMO, through myself and Edward Matthews, we have made a number of submissions on this. We have looked at the unintended consequences of removing a requirement for a nurse or midwife to sit on the preliminary committee or a fitness to practice when dealing with a nursing and midwifery matter. So we would say clearly that it's very important that, if you're dealing with a midwifery matter, you'll have a midwife, or you're dealing with a nurse, you'll have a nurse. But ultimately, there must be a requirement for them to sit on the committee, so they can bring their expertise to bear. Pieces around exposure to publicity, where all sanctions in its original iteration required court confirmation, all sanctions being published, and we made comprehensive submissions, although I don't wish to unduly take credit for matters. They were primarily concluded by Edward Matthews, but again, just that we do maintain and keep a voice and very much keep on top of developments in this area, because ultimately we need to, on behalf of our members. There's a piece there around interim suspensions, which I won't go into in detail. However, just to be aware of it, there is a section of the Act, Section 58, in which an application can be made to suspend a nurse or a midwife for the purposes of protection of the public. In essence, if there's a view that there's an urgent and imminent need to do so in the public interest, and that does arise with a degree of frequency. And again, we would deal with that the same as we would deal with other matters, and that's a legal case that addresses some of the what do we mean when we talk about the public interest. The key issues, I suppose, like as I said, there is a rise in complaints. There's no question about it. That, and in particular, in relation to assistant director and director level, the COVID-19 pandemic has generated, to a large degree, a high proportion, not all, but a high proportion of these complaints. If I could take something general, they relate to an overall dissatisfaction with what I would call the care regime that's in operation, or perceived dissatisfaction, as it were. And regrettably, it's the case. The best way in our experience, and the key issues for senior nursing and midwifery managers are, and some of this may sound self-evident, and it's like when policies and procedures are there, but when one engages in a forensic analysis of things, it's difficult, to keep on top of everything all of the time. But the key, I suppose, issues are the existence of that we see it is comprehensive policies and procedures that ultimately underpin the practice of nursing and midwifery within a particular facility or within a particular area, if it's the community. A key thing to have is staff training, and that's records, frequency, regular reviews of training requirements. There's no director or assistant director, that will be on top of every single aspect of this every day of the week, and it does require a degree of, delegation. So, for example, in a particular area, maybe a CNM2 or a CMM2 might, part ensure that they ensure people are trained regularly or do staffing reviews, and that on a regular basis. The issue of care planning comes up a lot in this context, and in particular, when I say about, on admission update, what type of an assessment is done on admission? Is it updated regularly? Is there training on care planning? Are the care plans robust? Do they accurately reflect, a presentation or a development? And that's obviously equally applicable in an acute service as the care of the elderly or the community. The key issue that we find is the auditing of care, and nursing, and the quality of midwifery and nursing notes, and auditing of policies and protocols. Do they need revision? And again, I preface this by saying there's no director or assistant director can be, can keep on top of every single aspect, of this and it does require delegation, as you will know, from your role. You won't necessarily need me to tell you that, but just these are the key areas that come up, and they're the key pieces where we can successfully defend our senior nursing and midwifery managers teams, that the existence of these policies, because very frequently, as I have said, at a senior level, you mightn't necessarily be providing direct care. Some will, but these complaints arise from an overall dissatisfaction with the care regime. And the key, I suppose, thing that we've taken out of all of the, I suppose, the variety of different complaints that have come in against senior members of our profession are the extent to which the architecture is there that underpins appropriate practice, and that is one's best defense as a senior member of a team to such a complaint. The other piece there is, I suppose, is HICWA reports, and this issue comes up to maybe in a lot in maybe care of the elderly or ID services, but in all services it's not. But insofar as I've encountered it with complaints against senior members of our profession, again, if HICWA and people might have different views, and I respect the fact that HICWA have a role, but sometimes myself, and I'm sharing an invocation with you, I wonder the extent do they recognize, if at all, the reality, and that's not advocating, as any particular matter is a justification for poor, for the provision of poor care. But in my own view, they can be, quite intemperate, for want of a better word, in their findings, and don't appear, in my view, to have sufficient regard for the challenges that prevail in either managing a particular service or working within it. But ultimately, it's extremely, HICWA reports are something that are very compelling in the context of a complaint to one's regulatory body. And it's particularly important to demonstrate as a senior nursing and midwifery manager that steps were taken within the extent to which one can, that ultimately that the steps are taken if such a report comes in. So I suppose that's a very broad overview. I can send this presentation to anyone who wishes, but I suppose that is my very broad overview. And I think I'm running to schedule, although I'm sure Niamh will tell me if I'm not.
You are, David. And there's a question that follows on from your HICWA part perfectly. Somebody is asking, can you offer some insights into supports available for DON's person in charge following regulatory inspections, please?
Do you mean within the INMO or within places of employment?
Maybe the person hasn't clarified that.
Okay, well, I can cover both, Fiona.
Okay.
Sorry.
I might have a clarification here.
Well, I can do
INMO, they're asking.
Well, I suppose what we try to do is, at first instance, the support we provide, the way we manage that, I suppose internally would be is that myself and Edward Matthews are available to any, and people do contact us to say, well, the most common situation is, say, for example, there's an adverse, HICWA report, and a particular director or an assistant director is, they're doing their best to try and action the matters, or to say, this is what we need, this is what we don't need, I need more resources here. That is very common, and inevitably that involves us becoming involved. That involves us in making representations on their behalf directly to the employer, and that's the most common way that we do that. And we do get those calls. I don't know, people may disagree with me, but I also, I suppose, we do try to, just from a general basis, like even from today's session, in terms of what I am delivering to you, just so I suppose you're aware of, that our senior nursing and midwifery managers are aware of, the support that's available through myself and Edward Matthews. And we do try as well to organise these sessions and, sections through the section, which does need a bit of revival and something that we're going to look at. In my own view, from the employer's perspective, again, people may disagree with me or not disagree with me, but I do find there is a lack of support sometimes, for particularly at a senior level, for people, organizations. Again, this is my perception of it from dealing particularly with regulatory complaints that come in against our members. Like, you become the director, you become the assistant director, and you're expected to know everything and be on top of everything, and that's something, and I do think it's there is a lack there, of support sometimes from the employer's perspective. But again, that's something that we try to keep on top of. We always try to provide, I suppose, the support through education and through these sessions, but as and when basis to say, look, well, I'm having this problem, I need you to address it. Can I just actually say, sorry, and I'm conscious of time, but I want, sorry, just as well, Fiona, and please stop me, Fiona, just as well, in terms of, let us just say a complaint came in against a director or an assistant director, and there was evidence that say I wrote to a particular employer and I say, this report came in, Mr. or Mrs. such and such made every conceivable effort to engage, you know, with you. However, it remains the case that, like, for argument's sake, you will not provide the resources. I have made representations on staffing, and unfortunately the group or the CHO or whatever it is, or the organization, you know, will not provide the step, or they will not take the steps that I need them to take. That's very compelling to say, well, this was the regime, this was the HICMA report, but I, in my capacity of director or assistant director, took this step. And that's very useful and has been very useful in the past. Sorry, was that very long, Fiona?
That's
Sorry.
lovely, David. Thank you very much.